Hello everyone, and welcome to the EDLD 611 final project. Mine is covering the Adult Learner Success Workshops. I'm Tim Nellett, and let's get started. So first we're going to talk about why we're going with workshops as a potential program for supporting adult learners in higher education. One big reason is that adult learners are sometimes at a pretty big disadvantage when entering higher education. Sometimes there's been a lot of time between their last formal academic setting and their current one. They're usually a minority among the student body, and there are often a lot of things competing for the attention, time, and energy of adult learners compared to some of their more traditional peers. The setting of a workshop invites knowledge building, practical application, and community building among peers that can address some of the factors that might set an adult learner at a disadvantage in higher education. Workshops also tend to be an easier demand on an adult learner's time and energy compared to courses or conferences or other high demand items that might provide the same outcomes. Often they can be held during the times when classes are less likely to be in session, maybe at a centralized location on campus, or even if you're working with a group that's predominantly off campus, there might be some options for that as well. So the Adult Learner Success Workshops, or ALWSs as I call them, can leverage and bolster existing adult learner communities and help generate new ones. So we're going to focus on things like skill building, community building, to address the critical needs of filling knowledge or competency gaps, while also reducing isolation and a commonly found disconnection to campus. Some of the program objectives here, really the main focus is to develop or refresh competencies, build community peers, and increase integration, involvement, and ultimately retention among adult learners. This is also what you'll see later going to be evaluated on as well. We want to really focus on instilling things like academic readiness skills, things specifically around competencies about transition, so debunking myths around imposter syndrome or other deficit-based thinking, which adult learners might suffer from, identifying useful resources on or off campus that can be helpful to them, and then through all of that, by bringing adult learners together in this workshop setting, build a community and cohort of peers for continued support post-workshop or workshops. These outcomes were chosen based on the need for adult learners to develop knowledge and competencies that can have a benefit in different ways for their well-being. And since adult learners have been found to have an intrinsic need to manage their own learning, the workshops actually are great to provide an opportunity to do just that. They can have a little bit more control over the content, the flow, and the outcomes of a workshop compared to a regular course they might be taking. And lastly, as part of building this community of peers and increasing integration, we really want to capitalize on a adult learner's sense of belongingness to frame these program objectives. So we want to kind of capitalize on the work by Strayhorn back in 2015, and since then, that describes a sense of belongingness and an intrinsic need that students have and adult learners as well. So these various items will be served as a student learning outcomes, which you'll see in a little bit, for both each individual workshop as well as all the workshops as a whole. So our audience, of course, adult learners. Now, the description of what adult learner is can kind of vary from campus to campus, so we didn't really want to limit it too much. But we're looking at people that exist outside of what, as in higher ed, has been described as traditional student age range. So specifically, but not limited to, newer adult learners. We're allowing, of course, current adult learners and really encouraging current adult learners, those who have had a little bit more time under their belt, to attend the workshops and provide peer support that way and be part of that community building. But then especially early on, the workshops are going to be targeted to mostly newer adult learners. And again, outside of traditional range, so approximately 25 and up. The other factors can really vary based on the workshop themselves and the campus that it's being conducted at. So we don't want the type of the module to be a limiting factor in who's coming in and who's participating in the workshops. Another thing we focus on heavily with the audience is things like access. So of course we want to make it free to participants. We want to find other ways to mitigate some of the barriers that might impede adult learners from attending the workshops. So things like childcare, parking if they're a commuter, working around kind of the schedules of those adult learners, so trying to find a time that fits best. It's another thing that makes a workshop really effective is that it can be a little bit more flexible in time and place than courses might be, because they're very, they have to play off of the other courses within an academic schedule. Program support, really key roles to the success of something like these workshops are two main ones, being the program facilitator and the content deliverer. Now, the program facilitator, most often in the execution of a workshop, is going to be someone who already has a stake in the success of adult learners at that particular institution. Maybe it's someone on faculty who their focus, their research is the success of adult learners, or maybe if the school has a center or a institute that's focused on adult learner success, that someone, a program coordinator or manager in that center would be a really good fit for that position. And then, of course, the content deliverers, that could also be found within the same place. It might be a staff member who's focused on exactly that, providing content to adult learners that can help in their personal academic success. Might also be a faculty member who's a subject matter expert in a particular field or fields. That's something that's really flexible in this design of the workshop, is we don't want to limit who can participate in the process in terms of delivering content. Because there might always, there's always a best person or a best fit for something, and it doesn't always the person that's directly involved. So if they're the content deliverer or the program facilitator isn't the best fit and most familiar with that content, we want to find who is and establish those partnerships. Good example here would be establishing an adult learner advisory board or advisory council ahead of the workshop if they already don't have one. Excuse me, and leveraging that as a good way to help facilitate this as well. Thinking about other local partnerships too, we could look at this, and this kind of goes in with the budgeting later as maybe a really great option for some synergy. Is like a local bank representative may be interested in delivering a course workshop on financial literacy and building that competency for adult learners. And they're also gauging interest of current adult learners who may wish to pursue a new career in the finance industry. So this is a combination of kind of the local community and making connections there, and then also providing potential career development opportunities for these adult learners while delivering the impactful content of the workshop itself. Instructional plans and formats. So really focusing heavily on the module format for the workshops. They should be flexible enough to encourage tailoring and adaptable in content to accommodate a variety of audiences, and self-contained in order to allow for adjustments in the order of workshop delivery based on the needs of the students in an often rather tricky or complex academic schedule. In this way, this requires a lot of adaptability, but on the part of the facilitators and the content deliverers, so it's a little bit more effort heavy on that side in order to accommodate the adult learners that are attending that particular semester and have expressed interest and signed up for the workshops. So giving them kind of almost like an a la carte option, so to speak. You have a set of modules and then generate interest in the initial RSVP that states kind of, okay, these out of the 25 respondents we had for this semester, 20 of them really focus heavily on financial literacy, so you might be pushing that workshop a little bit more regularly or a little bit more heavily than other ones. The content itself, mostly delivered in some sort of presentation format, something that's easily formatted across different disciplines. So PowerPoint's a great example. Prezi might work too. It allows for uniformity among design, even if the content changes. So you always have kind of, for continuity's sake, the students, the adult learners attending the workshop see that, okay, this is a adult learner success workshop for sure. I can tell because it looks like all the other ones, even if the content's changed. Some of the big focus activity points in the workshops are the lecture itself, so the delivery of that content, activities that allow them to shape their learning by engaging with it and engaging with each other, and that's part of that community building aspect too. Some Q&A, of course, we want to be able to question what's being discussed and work with the knowledge and the content that way too. And then, of course, resource linkage. So when something is connected to the workshop module that could help the adult learners outside of it, for example, if there's more in-depth knowledge about financial literacy outside of the workshop, you want to be able to connect it readily to that. Evaluation plans. So really evaluating several different learning outcomes here. Like I mentioned before, the big three are skill building, competency development, connectedness to campus, and a sense of belonging. This is going to be done a couple different ways. The pre-workshop assessments are critical. We really want to look at, we're kind of looking at the impact of something intervention-esque like a workshop where content's being delivered, which then the student is able to use to improve their own academic personal well-being. You need to have kind of a pre and post in order to show that that impact has actually been done. Initial assessments will be critical in this way because the development of competencies as measures change over time. And so the workshops are really the catalyst for things like knowledge, skill, and competency development. So the post-workshop assessments will be tailored specifically to each workshop. And then they also have end of semester, end of year assessments, which will be kind of more like a larger encapsulation of what that adult learner achieved by attending the workshops. And that's really going to get at some of the more long-range objectives, which are the connectedness to campus and sense of belonging. So if you have kind of a cohort, essentially, of those who initially sign up for the workshops and attend, X amount of them throughout the semester, you can conduct the pre-workshop assessment, which will cover all the different competencies that will be featured to kind of get a baseline. Post-workshop assessments for each individual workshop based on the competency that they're developing. And then long-term, you're looking at sense of connectedness and retention, things like that. Additionally, there's kind of an expectation that certain factors would improve as multiple workshops are attended. So really kind of the expectation here is that adult learners who attend multiple workshops would have a greater sense of connectedness to their campus and a greater sense of belonging and more likelihood of staying at that particular school from attending multiple workshops rather than just one or two. Scheduling and staff needs. Really, in an ideal world, you only need 2, although greater funding or capacity among participants in the initiative, in the workshop initiative, could increase that staffing capacity. But at the very, very minimum, you should only need the facilitator and the content deliverer. And they would kind of work in tandem, right? The facilitator would be kind of the heavy on recruiting folks, conducting marketing and outreach regarding the workshops, scheduling space, time, adapting to the changes as needed, kind of doing ongoing program management around the workshop. And the content deliverers focus, of course, specifically on the content itself, conducting the lecture, managing and facilitating the activities, producing handouts and templates and other resources the adult learners might be able to use. And so they would work closely together, but in different roles. But those would be kind of the main 2. And like we discussed earlier, it could be one content deliverer, or it could be multiple. And that, of course, will change the dynamics of the scheduling and the staff needs. Of course, if you're working with multiple people, you might have difficulties around scheduling, but that might also be one of the criteria around choosing content deliverers, is being able to maintain whatever particular schedule you're facilitating the workshops on. And as you see down here, scheduling, we're looking at typically bi-weekly. I think that it's also really effective to alternate every other week. If there's something like an adult learner organization on campus, or some sort of student org that specifically addresses non-traditional students, partnering with that org is great for several reasons, but one of the good ones that could be effective is scheduling the meetings of those orgs in alternate with these workshops, so that adult learners get very familiar with, if they're participating in both, and hopefully they are, okay, Wednesday at 6 p.m., at this particular building. Will always be there that time, because I know that either we're having a student org meeting or we're having a workshop. And that makes it kind of establish a best practice of consistency. And of course, you can adapt to the needs of the adult learners. If there's different times or places that are better at different points of the year, maybe you could move the workshops. But providing consistency is also a really great way to ensuring that cohort model, at the get repeated workshop attendance. There's some other scheduling implementation options available, depending on what's available at the school. There's also some things to be considered about in terms of incentives. So making sure that the workshop is accessible and really easy to secure buy-in in that way. So this is a factor that may be tailored depending on the makeup of the adult learner student body in a particular term. For example, if there are an above average amount of adult learners working evenings, workshops may be offered in the daytime instead, or vice versa. Budget, marketing, and facilities. So initially, cost of the workshop would be low during the pilot semester or year, and really in hopes that the outcomes from those workshops justify kind of a larger line item or additional more sustainable funding to grow, enhance, and disseminate the workshops out further. The main cost of the program really associated with the time of both the coordinator and the content deliverer or deliverers. You might be looking at depending on how your funds are coming in for these particular staff or faculty members. If it's about time based on effort, you might be looking at 10% of that coordinator's time, probably 5% or less on the deliverer's time. If it's just one of the strategic goals or objectives that particular office has, you can kind of roll these ongoing responsibilities into the coordinator's regular job duties and probably wouldn't require a separate allocation. Space rentals can be mitigated too, particularly if everything's being done in-house. So the student org I mentioned earlier might be able to secure space for the workshops at no cost. So that can be helpful for keeping costs down as well. Some of the things that will drive up the cost but might be critical or very effective for achieving buy-in are things like providing parking, food, and childcare. Removing as many barriers as possible to access these workshops can really ensure their attendance is consistent or growing. Food being a critical one, and then parking and childcare, I would say, in addition to that, could also be really effective. These things could sort of be mitigated by those Department of Corporate Partnerships I was talking about earlier. So if that bank is providing someone to facilitate the financial literacy workshop, maybe they're also able to leverage funds to provide food for that particular workshop or additional workshops. In return, they get access to some pretty awesome students on that campus in the form of the adult learners attending the workshops. And they might be having a great pool to draw from for future staff members at their particular corporation. Should also be looking at a very intentional marketing plan, and that's kind of a combination of things like branding and both outreach and messaging. The outreach and messaging portion is really critical here. Want to leverage different methods to achieve awareness of the workshops, and that's something that does grow over time, but will need to be on a cyclical schedule, in the fact that you have new adult learners come in every semester and every year. Since awareness of the program is a barrier to access, we want to mitigate that as much as possible. So we're looking at utilizing the professional organizations connected to adult learners. So that center, that institute, that student org I was mentioning before, mailing lists, targeted outreach through admissions and enrollment, if you can establish and leverage those partnerships. If they have an indication in their database that you are as an adult learner coming in, you can do early outreach that way. And then of course kind of the more generic options of flyers, events, and campus websites. Particularly after the workshops have been implemented in the first run, what I think would be really successful is using workshop graduates to both attend the future workshops and provide some insight there, but also use them to secure more buy-in and kind of vouch for them with the new adult learners. Say, hey, I was in your shoes just a year ago. There was a lot going on, but attending these workshops is really beneficial to me. I think that personal buy-in goes a long way and can be really effective towards securing new adult learner buy-in on the workshops too. Branding is something that could be potential for long term, and if I'm trying to achieve more sustainability of the workshops and then expand them and disseminate them out further. And after initial success of the workshops has been determined through assessment evaluation, they can be scaled up through different modalities or different funding mechanisms to increase reach, and branding probably be really key and important for that. That might include inviting the facilitator and content deliverers to present at workshops at different campuses. That might be setting up a train-the-trainer model to implement the workshops on multiple sites, or converting the workshops into modules that can be packaged and kind of sent out to different colleges. So that might be more of an online format. Events and timeline. The initial calendar you look at for the first round of workshops is 1 year. So if we're thinking fall 2019, for example, we start development now, and accessing and connecting with those content deliverers, kind of setting them up in advance, working to develop the curriculum of the workshops, the overarching kind of branding, structure, and theme, and timing of when which workshops would be delivered, setting up the assessment piece, RSVPs to the workshops for new adult learners, so they can take those pre-workshop assessments, identify which topics and content would be most helpful to them, so you can kind of frame the workshops accordingly, and then look at a fall and spring implementation, followed up by a summer for feedback gathering and then additional program enhancement. On a traditional 16-week semester, you're probably looking at about 8 modules delivered, maybe give or take, depending on things like holiday breaks and just kind of the rhythm and flow of a particular term. It might be something where it's better to have fewer modules and fewer workshops that are more heavily attended rather than having less. Just kind of depends from semester to semester and the needs of the students. The time requirement of each workshop would be approximately about 1 hour per week, or every other week, excuse me, for program participants. So I mean, depending on the needs of the students and capacity of the content deliverers, probably 8 hours of delivery each semester, with some prep work ahead of those. I'm looking at probably 3 hours total for each module that's delivered. And a majority of the student outcomes would be on the same timeline as the workshops, like I mentioned before. Understandably, some of those would depend on the content, like a workshop on financial literacy should impart desired content delivery by the end of the workshop. For others, that might be more long-term. You're thinking about academic readiness or success, that might take an entire semester to see the fruits of that work, given the fact that you won't get grades until the end. And then, of course, things like the cohort development would be on a longer timeline as well, more on a semester or year-based timeline. And there are my references. I hope you enjoyed the overview of the Adult Learner Success Workshops. I think they're highly malleable and can be tailored to suit the needs of particular adult learners on your campus. And I think that they're really great about imparting particular competencies to adult learners that meet their needs, while also kind of on the back end building up those relationships so that adult learners don't feel like they're really kind of on their own, attending school with traditional age peers that they don't necessarily connect with, but that there are a lot of adult learners on campus, or a lot of non-traditional students on campus, and that if they get put in the kind of a workshop setting, they can build these relationships, feel more connected to their school and to each other, and lead to longer and ongoing success. Thank you.